Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Maximizing the Late Season Pass, Protecting and Enhancing Crop Performance webinar presented by PhycoTerra. This discussion will explore how to optimize late season passes by combining fungicide protection with plant performance strategies to improve consistency, protect yield, and maximize return on investment under high disease pressure. I'm Hillary Nguyen, the Custom Content Manager for Meister Media Worldwide, publisher of Crop Life magazine, and the host of this webinar. This webinar has been approved for 0.5 CEU credit in crop management from CCA. To receive credit, you must watch the entire webinar. An attendance notification will be sent at some point during the webinar, and you must respond to receive credit. If you respond once the webinar is finished, you will receive an email with the QR code for reporting your credit. You simply scan the QR code and submit it. Please do not close your web browser before the webinar has ended completely, or you will not receive the email with the QR code. This is also for the viewers watching the archived webinar. Now, I'd like to go ahead and introduce our speakers, Dustin Blunier and Wade Walters. Dustin is the Director of Agronomy at PhycoTerra. He is an experienced agronomist and agribusiness professional with a strong track record in the commercial agriculture industry. In his current role, Dustin bridges the gap between research, product development, and commercialization teams, translating field-level insights into actionable information and strategies, supporting the dissemination of performance data, product messaging, and trial results. Wade is a fourth-generation farmer and primarily focused on the financial, marketing, technology, and procurement aspects of the operation. He is a lifelong resident of Shickley, Nebraska, a 2010 graduate of Shickley High School, and a 2014 graduate of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln with a BS in agribusiness, banking, and finance option, and a minor in grazing livestock systems. Away from the farm, Wade is a director of the Nebraska Soybean Association, vice president of the Shickley Community Foundation, and in his third term as a member of the Shickley Village Board of Trustees. At this point, I will turn the webinar over to our speakers. Dustin and Wade, welcome.
Thank you, and welcome everybody to this webinar. Hope everyone is having a good, productive day. As they said before, our title of this webinar is Maximizing the Late Season Pass. And, you know, as we put together this content, really the core is you commonly have referred to that in a lot of areas. They'll refer to that as the fungicide pass. And the reason that people look at that fungicide pass, or why they have typically done that, called it the fungicide pass, is that's been the predominant mode of action within this pass. And as technology has increased and in the environment that we're in today with tight margins, there's a lot more to this pass that can determine not just the success, but what level of success that you have when you look at this late season pass as a whole management practice. And there's a lot more elements to it as we allude to here than just protecting against disease, but also just looking at enhancing the performance of your crops. And so our goal for today is really to give you a framework to talk or to have a discussion around breaking down this pass into the different elements that can enhance that performance or enhance that production, and how we can show value of those each incremental parts. And that actually leads to a much more productive conversation with growers in the standpoint of how we can help and how we can deliver value at that farm gate or at that farm level. So that's what we're going to kind of dig into here today, and just kind of that's the core element as to why we're kind of showing that as a late season pass, and really kind of playing off of really kind of evolving it from more than just talking about it as a fungicide or a defense pass, but all of the elements that are in there. And let's start off by looking at the history. Why is this looked at as the fungicide pass, and why was that protection, or why is that protection so valuable at this stage in the plant process? And really, you have to kind of start with what's going on within the plant at this stage. And by this stage, what I'm talking about is those early reproductive stages. We've gotten to the point of the plant has grown. We're into that standpoint of we're in that reproductive. So, you know, in corn, R2, soybeans, R3, Where is that value coming from? And really, when you look at the plant physiology at that stage to maturity, or when you get to finishing, you're looking at basically about a 40% impact on yield that's really yet to be realized or to be established from that stage to maturity. So for the sake of argument, if you look at, today's corn production practices, if we look at it roughly at 40%, we're talking basically about 100 bushel impact that is yet to be kind of realized in that production practice. And so that's where that value comes from within this pass, is because we can have that impact. Now, I'm not saying that you can manage 100 bushel, because Mother Nature is a huge factor within that 100 bushel impact. I'm talking overall within that environment. What's going to happen from, say, early July or whenever you hit to those reproductive stages till the time you get to harvest? That's what I'm saying, our variability impact. That's what the science and the research would sit there and say. And I break that down into kind of two different areas. There's what Mother Nature is going to either give or take in that standpoint. So that's going to be your water availability, your heat stress, your environment. And then there's going to be the management practices that you're going to have from that stage on, that's either going to protect or add yield to that environment as well. Those are kind of the two things that are going to kind of make that up. And to give you kind of perspective, you're going to, in those early reproductive stages, you're going to peak at water intake on a daily basis. You're going to be in probably some of the highest temperatures as far as air ambient temperature. You're going to have probably the most variability in humidity. And so that all of those factors drive in to creating an environment that can be really fragile on that end capacity to build yield within there. And so when we look at that fragility, we really want to look at what are we looking, we want to look at basically the scientific advancements within crop production practices, but also just in general of what that plant is performing. When we look at why disease management has been important or been so valuable, the overall aspect is you're protecting that plant health. But plant health is more than just disease mitigation, is what we're finding out with our research, is we can actually generate performance beyond just that production if we can manage the stress and the other variabilities that create that fragile response that we're looking at in that environment, in that growth season, as that crop is finishing off its yield and putting in that finishing grain fill or production capabilities that we see in that late season. So as we look at that evolution within that system, I want to kind of step back and we looked at this past historically. And one of the things that always kind of comes out when we look at this is we look at it from a standpoint of, does it have consistency? And you've probably, if you've had experience within this going back several years, you would see that a number of things, when we look at it just as a fungicide pass, affect that response or that consistency or that reliability of the response. And so, is it a disease heavy year? The hybrid selection that I have, is their hybrid response greater or less based on the characteristics of the hybrid or the variety that we've looked at? And then also more recently, like the timing, based on the type of disease pressure that we have, that the environmental conditions can be right for certain diseases versus other ones. And so we look at a timing aspect of, do I make that decision now? Can I impact that within that? All of those things factor into what you would probably have heard in the standpoint of, do I have consistency within that response? And that can lead to a lot of decision making and discussion around whether I should make that pass or not. And so with what we're talking about today, we really want to look into looking at not just disease protection, but looking at the challenges to look at more than that aspect from a standpoint of, oh, I didn't have much of a disease pressure this year, so I overpaid for that pass. Or, yep, I did have, it was a bad disease year, and it was a good investment. We want to look at basically setting up and looking at it from a full management decision-making process. And when we do that, we're able to move away from looking at just disease protection, where those variables would dominate the ROI and the value, and we can introduce other elements that work in concert with that disease protection to help deliver more consistency and results. And so that's what we get at when we look at basically looking to evaluate this late season pass as an element to look at performance. And so what we're looking at with that is we're looking at how can we help manage the environmental factor. So as said earlier, soil moisture and just overall water availability for that plant in the late season is very critical. So what is our environment for that water? Now, Mother Nature is going to drive that water availability unless you're in an irrigation standpoint. But from a plant health standpoint, the ability of that plant to capture and move that water is a big indicator of its performance within that plant system. It's not just having that water available, but that water being able to move through that plant and help that plant function. So we're looking at managing that aspect of it in conjunction with the water, with the not water, but the environmental conditions that we're in with that. Environment also looks at your temperature and are you in a high heat? Are you in a dry scenario? Are you looking at humidity? Humidity will drive changes in temperature, can drive conditions for that disease, and also it will also drive that how responsive that plant has to work in its standpoint of in its respiration processes with the photosynthesis and the plant cycles that it's going to go through. And so that's a big element that we look at from a performance standpoint. The other thing I want to talk about here is when we look at performance and we talk about where that plant is on managing for more than just a plant protection, but looking at how do we get that plant to perform through those into seasons. I look at it from a standpoint of in those discussions with growers to talk about you're at a stage, and keep in mind we're going to be post tassel or we're going to be post flowering in our crops. We've gotten to that point in that growing season because of decisions that have been made early in the season. So we're not at that stage where we have a good stand of corn or a good stand of beans because we didn't do anything. We did management practices early in the season, whether that was during planting, setting that stage for emergence, or moving in through stages that we might be in right now, spraying for weed control and early season plant health. We set the stage to get to the standpoint of at that reproduction, and we're seeing the benefits of that. And so we really want to look at this last month, 2 months of that growing season and keep that momentum going. And so I would challenge you to look at that stage and challenge growers to look at it as we're kind of moving into another performance window. And if you look at it like right now, we're at that point, most people would be in a scenario, you're at early vegetative states. We're maybe at that stage where we're doing that last post pass. We're maybe doing some nitrogen applications or fertility applications on that growing crop. But you have all of these different performance windows, if you will, when we're looking at these stages. And late season is another performance window. So if you look at the progression, you're setting that population with your planting and all of your work to establish a stand. And then the stage we're in right now, we're looking at setting that yield potential. So in corn, we're setting that the size of that ear, the kernels around and how much potential that ear is going to put on is a result of how healthy that plant is in those early vegetative states. And when we get into this late season stage that we're talking about, that dynamic, it's evolving, but it's still there in the standpoint of we're looking at grain fill. How are we going to retain those kernels? How are we going to retain or how are we going to fill those kernels out? Because we set our population and we set our potential for the size of that. The performance window that we move into that late season is very much in a standpoint of, hey, we can put more yield. We're not just protecting that yield that we have already established, but we can actually put more yield into that crop by having that plant perform in these late stages. Okay, and I talk about corn with that kernel fill, but really we can look at that. We can apply that to beans and other or other crops as well. In beans, for example, early in the stages, you're looking at setting that population, setting that branching, the nodes. The old adage of you need more nodes to create more blooms to create pods, and when we get into that late stage, we're looking at filling those pods out. Higher fill rate, bigger beans within those pods are going to drive a larger yield response within there. So when we look at that, there's 5 things that I want to kind of talk through that really makes this more of a late season pass as opposed to a fungicide pass. And yeah, I know I've got 4 things on the slide here if you're paying attention. And I said 5. I did not miscount. This is my cliffhanger, if you will. We're going to talk through these 4, and then I'm going to introduce the 5th one as we kind of walk through that. But I think each one of these elements are an opportunity for crop consultants and advisors for you to have discussions with growers about basically increasing that reliability of this pass. Increasing the value of this pass is not putting all of these in at once, but really targeting and prescribing across all of these elements to where you can maximize the predictability or the reliability of that response, and then also maximize the performance of that crop by field, by environment, by yield, by year in the conditions that Mother Nature is going to give us. So let's dig into these 4 elements and kind of how some of that can work within the context of establishing your late season pass for your grower. So we start off with fungicides, and I kind of look at it from a standpoint of they're foundational. I mean, obviously, they got the namesake for this pass in a lot of areas and in a lot of terminologies. You hear that fungicide pass, and so there's a reason for that. The value that fungicides can provide in preventing and combating disease pressure to maintain that plant health is very essential and very foundational to what we're looking to establish for those last couple months as we get into grain field. But the big takeaway here is I use the term on the slide as, production doesn't equal performance, or another way to look at that would be performance is bigger than just protection when we talk about plant health. In today's genetics and advances that we've made in understanding plant physiology and biology, the value that we can gain or offset around plant performance is really much more than just fungicide response. If we look at just fungicide, we're going to be subject to some of those different variabilities, hybrid selection, disease conditions, But if we look at plant health on a more holistic basis, there's elements that we can help manage year in and year out that drive more than just protection and can drive a more consistent response to that late season pass. The next one I want to walk into is insecticides. And, insecticides are extremely valuable in a standpoint of if you have pest insects that have infested into a feeding, they can be very damaging, and we have great tools to help mitigate that. I have a background in crop inputs, and I was guilty of, back a few years ago when we had $7, $8 corn, and we were doing these passes of, we kind of have fallen victim as an industry into the throw it in mentality. When we look at insect pressure and we look at the cost to put insects into that pass, one of the things that I would challenge is, are we looking at proper thresholds? Are we managing insecticide or insect pressure? Are we managing that for proper thresholds and proper stewardship of that element? Because I would argue, in the standpoint of when we have that higher aspect and we look at just whether it's $2, $3, $5, whatever number you use from a standpoint of putting that in, that hasn't really helped in the standpoint of generating our best ROI within this pass. Because now that we look at tighter margins, that throw it in mentality starts getting into a scenario of, hey, if the threshold isn't there, what are we doing to beneficial insects? What are we doing to our overall biodiversity by introducing that control measure that maybe isn't necessarily our highest and best use of our time? And so one of the things we want to look at when we are looking at insect pressure and the damage that can cause in those late seasons is, what are our thresholds, and what is a scenario of using our skill set, our experience as crop consultants and advisors in the standpoint of targeting when we need that and when we don't. Because at that standpoint, we can add tremendous value. Or if we don't need it, what we're doing is we're just adding incremental cost to our application pass, and that's impacting the ROI and the value that we're bringing to that field, that operation, that growth. The third thing I want to talk through is the foliar nutrition. So when we look at late season, as we've established our crop, we're looking at the standpoint of when we get to that stage, there's still a lot of not just water, as we stated earlier, but there's a lot of nutrition being taken up by the crop in these late stages. And it's also going to be the area of, or I should not say the area, but the time frame that we're going to see where limiting nutrition aspects of limited nutrition are going to start impacting our yield potential. And so a huge value proposition to our late season pass is foliar nutrition. Late season nitrogen and potassium, for example, when you see limitations on that, it's a great opportunity to mitigate some of that risk. Boron is another example of a micronutrient, but there's also other micronutrients that could become a limiting factor. And so by managing this pass, looking at what our crop situation is, what the environment has been, and where we have seen imbalance or where we're running on a limiting aspect, bringing in nutrition into the discussion of our late season pass is a great way to address deficiencies, but also raise the high end, or raise the ceiling of our yield potential on that crop as we approach that. And it gets back into looking at the right rate or the right timing of these elements of, do we have, on the flip side of it is, do we have a need or are we putting nutrition out that's not necessary? So it's a scenario of looking at providing value to that grower is looking at, hey, what is the prescription needed for this crop or this situation that we're in? And that can be by field, that can be by year, within that aspect. But that's what we're looking at when we look at that foliar nutrition aspect, is raising that ceiling, but also raising it correctly in the standpoint of providing the right elements or the right nutritional pieces to what that crop needs to finish out that season. And then we move on the biostimulant side of things. So, this is still, I consider this still relatively new science, but as we have learned about plant physiology and as that science has developed, let me back up for a second. What I'm referring to with biostimulants is specifically the triggers to the plant. So we can put, for example, hormones and enzymes. You can even use living biologies that would trigger specific growth or specific responses within that plant. Very valuable in the standpoint of when we can sit there and get to reproductive growth and we can target that plant to trigger those reproductive elements, whether that's via hormones or enzymes. We can see where we can raise that ceiling. We can basically pull more value, more efficiency out of the inputs that we've put into this crop, whether that's been investment in the genetics potentials, whether that's been investment in the fertility. Our biostimulants are going to be a key element to helping us drive that yield. The challenge, or the flip side of that, is if you look at it from a holistic, we get into a standpoint of the reliability of those results. And really, we could do a whole training on the concept of biostimulants or biologicals and how they can impact or when they do that. For today's purposes, what I want to just basically leave you with on this is really what we need to be looking at when we do biostimulants in the late season path is understanding that specific mode of action and what that plant's going to trigger. Because the predictability or that lack of reliability really comes from the fact of you've hit a bottleneck. I.e., if I'm triggering or if I'm using a biostimulant to trigger a certain plant growth, do I have the plant set up to be able to do that? Or am I going to run into a bottleneck in this aspect? Good example would be is if you have a factory and your factory is built to create so many widgets a day or an hour, you have to maximize every aspect of that factory, every line in that manufacturing process has to run at a certain efficiency. And if you don't have one running, you create a bottleneck, and so that whole factory can't produce at a level that the factory is made for. And that's something to be looked at with that biostimulant case is, what am I signaling? What am I trying to trigger? Do I have the capabilities to capture that? And that's understanding what that biostimulant is doing from a mode of action is very important and a very valuable piece that can be brought into a grower's program if you can set the expectations correctly on that. So I've worked through all of the four elements that we kind of look at when we take this pass beyond. There's the four. The first four of the five really focus on the plant. And I do that intentionally because when we look at what's happening in the field and in our cropping system at this stage, protecting that plant and supplementing that plant with specific needs help drive that performance. The fifth element that we really get into shifts away from being focused solely on the plant, but we start looking at the environment that the plant is in. And that's what I want to kind of talk through here on this fifth piece. And that's basically looking at the phylosphere, or feeding that environment around the plant. And what I mean when we talk about the phylosphere. So at PhycoTerra, we study infears. So our just a little bit, if you're not super familiar with our company or our product portfolio, we feed the microbiome. That is our element from a product standpoint. And so we study the spheres, and what the spheres are is, it's like the phylosphere is the area around the leaf tissue. The rhizosphere would be the area around the roots. So the spheres are basically the hotspots where the microbial population of an ecosystem interacts with that plant. And so when we're talking about a relatively large mature plant that is in that reproductive growth stages, that's basically filling out and making the grain, the phylosphere becomes very important, and it's very dynamic. It's one of the most dynamic of the spheres that we study in a standpoint of impacting the plant. So it's an environment that impacts plant. The other four were directly on the plant or in the plant. What we're talking about now is the environment that's going to have a direct impact on the plant. And there's two elements that really work within that. It's going to be the susceptibility, so helping provide a defense mechanism or a shield for that plant. And then the other aspect is going to be regulation. So the susceptibility would be kind of your disease and the impact on disease vulnerability and pest attacking it. The regulatory aspect, or the regulation, is helping that plant through those different cycles, the photosynthesis and the transo-evaporation and the respiration cycles that the plant has. And so those are the big areas that this fifth element, when we look at managing this pass, is going to be extremely valuable on. And so what we're going to talk about or focus in on that sphere is, how do we feed the microbial population, or how do we keep that healthy? The big way to do that is to feed it. And so, as I said, it's a very dynamic sphere in the standpoint of, when you look at the leaf tissue, and we're talking about the sphere is the interaction between the surface of the plant and the atmosphere. That's that microscopic area that we're looking at. To give you a frame of reference, in a square centimeter, so if you're watching on a computer, look down, basically the size of of one of your keyboard, one of the elements on that, that's a square centimeter. You're going to have 10 million bacteria and about 1 million fungi on that surface, and they need food. And there's two areas that they can get food. One is from an external source, landing or being in that environment. And the second is basically the plant will exude lipid metabolites onto that surface to help feed that, so that it has that layer of protection. This biology, or this biosphere, if you will, is what drives the reliability of that plant's stress responses and resilience in this stage. Okay. And so what we're looking at is, by feeding, or by basically creating an environment where we have a robust population, is what we're driving at in this fifth element. Okay. So we kind of talk about it from a standpoint of, don't just protect that plant, but look at it from a standpoint of enhancing that environment. That's what that biodiversity is doing, and what we want to try and do at this stage for the plant to work, optimize its response and its performance, and in this environment. So we talk about it through one of the things that we do is we use that through a product called PhycoTerra FX, and basically this is a foliar treatment. It's a microalgae based product formulated specifically for the leaf or the phyllosphere-based bacteria and fungi. A little bit of background. So microalgae is basically nature's bottom of the food chain. So microalgae, basically single-cell organisms that occur in all living environments. They are basically the smallest known organism that can photosynthesize. They create food for bacteria and fungi. And so that is the sphere that I talked about PhycoTerra, our company. That is the space. We are a microalgae technology company. And so that's what we study and work on. Our foliar treatment is geared specifically for this type of environment. And what I'm looking at when I'm doing that is I'm looking at basically how we're working in this environment is a couple of different things. That susceptibility I mentioned earlier, susceptibility and that regulation. I want to talk about regulation first, and then I'll move to the susceptibility. So the regulation is that respiration and those cycle. The microbiome is basically on that leaf is your that is your regulatory agency, if you will. So that microbial environment is going to help that plant, trigger that plant to either increase respiration or decrease. It's going to help that photosynthesis cycle. The more robust that you have that microbiome, the better or the more responsive that regulation is going to be to increase that plant health performance within the environment that it's in. So that's one way that we're driving that is through that regulation process. The other aspect is the susceptibility. So that gets back into the disease element. If you guys talk about, or most consultants probably know, for disease, the amount of pressure or impact is driven by the disease triangle. So you have to have the pathogen, you have to have the environment, and then you have to have a susceptible host. That's what creates that disease triangle. And so when we talk about susceptible host, or we talk about that microbiome helping against that, what we're talking about is it basically creates a layer of protection. And if you look at the pictures on the screen here, we have basically a picture of a soybean leaf. One would be a typical leaf from a typical production practice. And then on the right, we basically have stamped this on agar to show basically the amount of microbial activity that is on the leaf surface. So we're on an agar plate under a amplification so that you can kind of see the element. And you can see there on the right, what we're doing is that microbial abundance and diversity creates almost like, think of it as almost like a light shirt. We've got a layer of protection on that plant that is basically decreasing the susceptibility that is for disease or pathogens to take effect. And so the analogy that I use is you're going to have a spore that is looking to infect your plant. If you look at those pictures, the right versus the left, if I'm a spore and I know it's naturally flying in, but if I'm going to land on a leaf surface, the one on the left is more susceptible because I can get to that surface a lot easier as opposed to the one on the right because it has that film of protection. So those elements to bring kind of together what we're talking about here, those elements of that microbial abundance and that feeding in that environment, we're going to get that regulatory aspect that's going to help that plant respond to the environment. And then we're also going to get this layer of protection that helps to basically bring that performance in the standpoint of we reduce the susceptibility within that process. So we're really looking at that's what we target when we're talking about moving from that paradigm. If you think of it as a paradigm shift from looking at just this pass from protection, but to actually move that into a whole performance aspect. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Wade. Wade, if you want to kind of jump in here and kind of give your analysis of kind of how you guys position and work through this, go ahead and take it away.
Sure. Thanks, Dustin. Yeah, as they introduced before, I'm a farmer from South Central Nebraska, and we tend to do a lot of trialing on our farm. We do consulting with a lot of different companies, kind of testing out methods and practices to see what works and what really doesn't, kind of across our operation. So kind of what I'm going to cover today is just kind of a little bit more around the lines of what goes into our decisions of how we decide what to apply or when to apply with the fungicide pass. So first off is just the fungicide itself. We kind of look to see what our disease pressure is out there to kind of gauge, is the pass required in the first place? What diseases are out there? What do we need to go out and target? And also kind of gauging that along with the timing of when that disease pops up. Am I going to get a return on my investment, or is it too late in the season to potentially go in there and cause any benefit with that fungicide? So we're going out there in our area mainly scouting for, is southern rust a presence in our area? Has tar spot moved in? Northern corn leaf blight, just a lot of diseases like that, trying to see, is there something we can go out there and get ahead of if it's coming into the field. So scouting is just a big aspect of that on our operation, trying to make sure that we're not leaving any bushels on the table by missing out on trying to protect the crop from any disease that might be moving in. Moving on to like insecticides though, that one gets to be a little more tricky. Kind of like Dustin said, we don't want to go out there and just willy-nilly throw insecticides out just to do it. We want to make sure that we have the proper threshold to treat. We've found that, you can probably kill off more beneficial insects than you actually kill detrimental ones by going out there and just blanket spraying insecticides. So we've kind of went through the approach to make sure that, whatever we're targeting is at a threshold where it's going to actually take bushels away before we go out there and apply any sort of insecticide during the season. So, and also with that, we kind of have to watch too anymore with the traits that are in plants. Is there built-in trait protection from some of these insect pests? So we got to kind of gauge along the lines of, is this insecticide basically doubling up on what a trait is already taking care of? So that's kind of one thing we look at when going through that decision-making process on our operation. Kind of going into the foliars side of things, or things that we add on with our fungicide passes if need be. Tissue testing is something we've kind of went to on our operation to really make sure that what we're throwing out there foliar nutrition wise is actually beneficial. So we'll go out and pull some tissue tests, a couple weeks prior to what we think our fungicide window is going to be for that last pass of the season, and just kind of take a look at, if there's a deficiency, we'll go out and throw a foliar product with it. Like the beans, we test a lot of things. Sometimes we will just go out and do, say, one pass, 5-10 acres in a field, whatever it might be, with foliar nutrition, kind of build that database for ourselves for the future to kind of see if we can get a plant response and do anything else. Kind of the same on the biologicals, the biostimulants. We've been trying a lot of products at the current time, just trying to see if we can get plants to respond in a way that creates beneficial yield. And so we're really just trying to see if we can protect the yields out there, try to find the products that work in our environment on our operation to kind of make sure that we're not just throwing things out there just to throw them out there. We want to test, verify, and then we build on that with our practices. So maybe in year one, we try 10 or 20 acres of a product, proves itself out. It'll be across our whole operation in a couple of years. So that's kind of the approach we take to trying to make sure that what we're putting out with some of these newer products is working and creating value for us as a farmer. From the pass as a whole too, we just kind of in general, we like to look and make sure that, the whole package, everything mixes together well, everything, one doesn't harm the others. For when you're putting together a whole portfolio of fungicides, insecticides, biologicals, micronutrients, you name it, we want to make sure that one, it's easy to apply, and two, all of the products mix well together with each other. So we're definitely looking at that really hard when we make that last pass decision, trying to make sure that we're not going to hurt anything, burn a crop, do anything bad like that, but also make sure that the applicators don't have any issues out there in the field. And then just kind of lastly, along that same line of gauging the pass, trying to make sure we have the right timing for that application. We found that that's really important, kind of knowing to gauge when you go out and apply crop protection products like fungicides and other add-on applications to that as well. So, if you're going out at that V8 early window, or if you're going out at the VT-R1 window, certain products work well earlier, certain products work better later. So we really just have to gauge, what is that ideal window we're shooting for? Is what we're throwing in the tank going to be beneficial at that growth stage? So we kind of want to gauge that as well to make sure that everything we do is for the best interest of the crop. Getting that applied, proper timing as well as proper time of day, application method as well has been one thing we've really seen on our farm. So trying to apply in the mornings with these fungicide or foliar passes has been a lot more beneficial than the ones we've had in the afternoon. We've got some good data on that. And as well as just making sure that we get proper coverage also. We've went to a lot of drone application on our farms for this specific pass, and that has helped us to get more even, uniform coverage compared to what a plane has given us in past years, and even comparing side by side. So those are some of the things we kind of look for on our farm to make sure that we are doing what's best for the crop and also what's best for our pocketbooks at the end of the day, trying to make sure that every dollar we spend, one, brings back an even or more return than what we're spending, so that we can make sure that we're growing the best crop possible and trying to, I guess, be the best farmers we can while still being curious and trying out new products, practices, methods, just to, hopefully raise that corn yield ceiling year after year. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Dustin to wrap up the presentation.
Thanks, Wade. So I guess I'm just going to kind of land the plane here as we're, kind of reaching our time frame, and we want to leave ample time for questions. So I would just really kind of walk it through. A key takeaway for us on this is really to just kind of look at this pass as an opportunity. As we're talking with growers and having this discussion around the late season opportunities, it is an opportunity to really provide more than just protection, and that's the point too. It's not about protection. You when you look at it just as a protection, you're leaving a lot of opportunities for enhanced performance, which is going to give you consistent, reliable results. And that takes you to the third part of, your tank mix partners, just as Wade kind of alluded to, is when you look at timing, when you look at needs, you can add a lot of value to that pass if you have an understanding of when stuff works and how it can kind of work. And then the fourth point is that the biology impacts that environment. A key takeaway from our standpoint is when you have that environment, and that environment is going to impact performance. And so there's a relationship, just like within our soil, just like within the plant itself. It's a living environment there on that leaf surface that's going to impact it. So, with that, like I say, I hope we've set a good foundation around that performance. And, we encourage you to use your experience and your skills to add that prescriptive element to that, because this is a scenario I firmly believe that when we look at late season management, we can create impact that's both generating a not just a higher ROI, but a better value to the grower and to our industry. So with that, we will kick it back if there's any questions, and we're happy to address anything that you would have there.
All right. Thanks, guys. Lots of great information there. And we do have some questions. But first, as a reminder, if you respond to the attendance notification for the CEU credit, please do not close your browser before the webinar has ended completely, or you will not receive the email with the QR code. All right. Now we can dive into the questions. Let me pull those up here. Okay. How much does the leaf microbiome actually influence plant health and yield?
Yeah. So I will take the actual to mean give me something quantifiable. I guess is how I'll kind of address that question. What we have seen in our research is obviously you look at the environment. There's a lot of factors that impact it. When we take everything down and isolate it out and look at just the microbiome on the plant, when we've increased that in highly controlled environments, we see about a 2 to 2.5% increase in the yield making potential. Now, when we introduce that into the environment, generally we're going to see that, but the variability of that is going to change just because of based on all the factors that we just talked about. From a standpoint of what is the disease pressure, what's the environmental conditions, what's going on within that plant, that can have an amplified effect on that. We look at amplification as a big thing that we look at within our research is when we have that microbiome, are we amplifying effects, whether that's disease protection, whether that's plant growth, those kind of things. And you can see some of those are a little bit less reliable in the standpoint of predictability, but generally what we see is about a 2 to 2.5, 3% increase, just isolated only to that microbiome response.
If you're feeding microbes, won't you feed the bad ones and possibly make disease worse?
Great question. And we get that one a lot. And I would just I'd take you back to that slide of basically our research shows the opposite of that is true. I understand where that comes from because, diseases or different pathogens are microbiome products or, they are bacteria or fungi at times. But really what happens is in a traditional growing sense, when we feed everything, we increase that microbiome. You get the theory is called competitive exclusion. And so what winds up happening is we don't see an increase. We actually generally see a decrease in those negative or pathogenic microbial communities because there's more of the beneficial and there's more of the neutral bacteria that are going to be consuming food sources. They're going to be taking up space and they actually kind of help hold those in check. So it is a great question and it's a very logical question, but generally what we've seen in our research is when we can increase everything as a whole, we see more consistency in that environment and it's harder for one specific pathogen or one specific bacteria to dominate.
How does the leaf microbiome impact stress response and consistency?
Basically, the big thing that we would see is on that stress response is it's that regulatory aspect that we talked about. So we would see basically from a standpoint of, the ability for that plant to respond to stress. So whether that's, high heat, dry, I gotta roll up, those kind of things, we would see basically a more positive response within that element.
All right, looks like we have one more. If fungicides protect the plant, who or what is protecting the biological environment around the plant?
So that's I'm not sure I understand that question. I'll try and put it into an element and if somebody wants to follow up on that. But yeah, so basically your fungicide is a very valid question there. So if you're protecting that plant, fungicide goes in, creates gets within that plant and puts a layer of protection. So when that pathogen tries to infect it, it kills it off. And so that's how a fungicide works. The environment around it, the way I guess I kind of think of I hope I'm framing this question correctly. But basically the way I look at that is, yeah, you're in we look at it as a food desert, or it's a very harsh environment in that phylosphere. The way we kind of study it is, you can have vast changes in temperature, you can have UV, all of those things can affect the population of that environment. And so a couple of things that are going to happen by feeding it, introducing a food source to that plant. And then the other aspect is being proactive on the plant health, because you're either going to have to feed it or provide that food source or something to that environment, or you're going to have the plant capable of feeding that environment through the metabolites that it's going to produce. And so those are the two elements that I would say are the key elements to being able to protect that plant environment, or specifically the microbiome within that plant. They work independently, but in concert. When you look at that disease protection that's going to happen within that plant, that is a different level or a different layer that we would be providing for protection. So that disease protection, that fungicide does get into that plant. And so you are creating kind of two levels of protection within that.
All right. Well, that does look like it is all of the questions. So I want to thank everyone for attending today's webinar. I especially want to thank PhycoTerra for presenting it, and a special thanks to our speakers, Dustin and Wade, for providing valuable insights into how growers can optimize late season passes by combining fungicide protection with plant performance strategies to improve consistency, protect yield, and maximize return on investment. If you want to watch the webinar on demand or revisit certain parts, it will be archived and available at the same link you used to access it today. You will also receive an email reminder of the archive with the link tomorrow. Thank you again for joining us. This concludes the webinar.